Fog drapes Edinburgh like a shroud as a governess walks alone, heartbroken, unchosen, unbowed. The man who promised her forever now lifts a wealthy widow's hand beneath a chandelier's glare. To save her brother, she steps into the very house that betrayed her and meets a surgeon whose silence speaks of wounds she recognizes. In rooms scented with carbolic and scandal, ledgers whisper, alliances shift, and a single choice sharpens: protect duty or surrender to a love that could end them both. A secret waits at the threshold, ready to set the city aflame. Tell us where you're listening from, and do you crave your historical romances fierce and tender, or glittering and dangerous? If you reach this moment, comment the word lantern. Edinburgh, Scotland, the year of 1881. The city rose from the fog like an old cathedral, solemn and unyielding, its narrow closes whispering with damp and secrets. Morning light barely touched the soot-streaked stone of the tenements as Minerva Kincaid walked with her head lowered, clutching her worn gloves to keep the cold from biting through. A fine drizzle fell, the kind that never announced itself yet soaked everything it touched, turning the cobblestones into glistening mirrors. Her breath came in small white clouds, fragile and fleeting, like her hopes that winter. She had thought herself immune to heartbreak. She had believed in reason, in discipline, in the steady rhythm of work and prayer, but reason had no defense against betrayal. Alistair McRae's voice still lingered in her ears, the warmth of his promises, the gentle insistence that their future was assured. Now his name appeared in every whispered corner of the city, paired with that of the most admired widow in Edinburgh, Mrs. Elowen Ramsay, wealthy, fashionable, and recently free from mourning. The announcement had come like a bell tolling at dawn, distant, inevitable, cruel. Minerva's eyes burned as she turned into the close that led to her lodgings, a modest room above a milliner's shop. Through the window, she saw her brother Finlay bent over his books, his face pale in the candlelight, 17 years old and already burdened with the knowledge of how precarious their lives were. She paused before entering, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. The fabric was thin, brushed wool in slate grey, serviceable, clean, unadorned. She could not afford beauty. Beauty was for women who had not been discarded. Finlay looked up when she entered. "You're late," he said gently, setting aside his ink-stained quill. His eyes, so like hers, the same shade of steel blue softened by warmth, searched her face. "Did you see him again?" She removed her gloves, laying them carefully on the table. "No," she answered, "and I hope I never do." But the image returned unbidden. Alistair at the university gates days before, his arm linked with Mrs. Ramsay's. He had looked transformed, confident, elegant, the gold of his cravat gleaming against his charcoal coat. When their eyes met, he offered only the faintest of nods, the kind reserved for acquaintances one prefers not to know. Minerva turned away from the memory, straightening a pile of Finlay's papers. "You've worked enough for tonight. You'll ruin your eyes." He smiled faintly. "If I am to win that scholarship, I cannot rest." She touched his shoulder, her fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary. "You will win it," she said softly. "You must." That night, as Finlay slept, Minerva sat by the window watching the gaslight flicker in the distance. The city breathed heavily beneath the mist, its heart beating in the sound of carriage wheels, the laughter of the wealthy drifting from the new town. Somewhere in that brightness, Alistair McRae celebrated a new beginning. She drew her shawl tighter, whispering to the darkness, "Let him have his fortune. I will have my purpose." The following morning brought a letter, unsealed, folded twice, written in a hurried hand. It came from Mrs. Penbury, the housekeeper of the McRae residence. The family, it seemed, was in need of a governess to oversee the education of a cousin newly orphaned. The salary was respectable, the address familiar enough to quicken Minerva's pulse. She sat motionless for a long time, her teacup cooling untouched beside her. To return to that household, to the very doorstep where her heart had broken, was unthinkable, and yet Finley's tuition loomed like a debt carved in stone. Pride, she reminded herself, could not feed them. That afternoon, she dressed in her best gown, a dark blue wool trimmed with modest braid, and pinned her hair in a severe bun. Before leaving, Finley handed her a small handkerchief embroidered clumsily with her initials. "For courage," he said, his smile uncertain. The McCrae residence stood near the meadows, its facade dignified but worn, much like the man who now answered the door. Dr. Rowan McCrae was taller than his brother, broader in the shoulders, and carried an air of deliberate restraint. His green eyes assessed her quietly, not with cruelty, but with something heavier, fatigue perhaps, or the memory of too many disappointments. His sleeves were rolled past his wrists, revealing forearms marked by faint stains of iodine. "Miss Kincaid?" he asked, his voice low, a little rough from disuse. "Yes, doctor. You are here for the position?" "I am," she replied, meeting his gaze without faltering. He studied her a moment longer, then stepped aside. "My mother is ill. My brother is seldom home. You will find the household quieter than most. Quieter." The word carried an ache she recognized. The air inside smelled faintly of disinfectant and damp wool, of duty lived in long hours. In the corridor, she passed a mirror and caught sight of herself, pale face, resolute eyes, and a dress that seemed too fine for the role she was about to claim. For a fleeting moment she saw not a governess, but a woman standing at the edge of her own resurrection. Rowan led her to the study, where sunlight filtered through lace curtains in tired streaks. Papers covered the desk, medical charts filled the walls. "You will oversee lessons in this room when I am absent," he said. "Mrs. Penbury will assist you with the household arrangements." Minerva nodded, her heart steady now. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, only full of things neither dared to speak. At that same hour, in another corner of the city, laughter rang through Mrs. Ramsay's drawing room as Alistair McCrae toasted to his fortune. Gilded mirrors caught the flicker of candlelight on his glass, but for all the glitter, he felt a faint unease, an echo, perhaps, of a name he could not bring himself to utter. That evening, as Minerva returned home, Finley awaited her by the window, his face pressed against the glass. "You went," he said softly. "You truly went." "I did," she answered, setting aside her cloak. He studied her face, searching for cracks. "Was it terrible?" She smiled faintly, weary but composed. "No. Only difficult." He nodded, thoughtful beyond his years. "I know you're trying to save me," he murmured. "But who saves you, Minerva?" She had no answer. The words clung to her long after the lamps were extinguished, long after the house had settled into silence. Outside, the fog thickened over Edinburgh, shrouding the streets and secrets of the living. And somewhere in that darkness, the faintest ember of something unnamed began to stir. Not hope, not yet, but the memory of it. The McCrae residence stood stoic against the broom that rolled in from the meadows, its ivy-cloaked facade darkened by time and dampness. Within its walls, Minerva Kincaid moved like a quiet current, never idle, never still. Each morning began with the ritual of awakening the shutters, folding linens left undone by overburdened staff, and brewing tea that often went untouched. Her presence was efficient, but never cold. She made herself useful without stepping into light not meant for her. In a house where grief had long taken root, silence became its own kind of language. Though weeks had passed since she entered this household not as a guest, not as a woman wronged, but as a governess returned out of necessity, Alistair McCrae remained an unsettling presence. He rarely addressed her directly, but his gaze, lazy, half-lidded, confident, never strayed far. At the breakfast table, he would offer her a smile too polished to be warm, his fingers lingering just a second longer on the rim of his teacup when she entered. Once in the corridor, they crossed paths near the morning room. He paused as though startled by her nearness, and said with maddening ease, "You always did favor grey. It suits you still." Minerva did not flinch. She merely inclined her head and moved past him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She would not rise to the bait. She would not show him the ruin he left behind. It was Rowan McCrae who caught her attention more frequently now, not with intention, but through quiet habit. Where Alistair's presence felt like a flickering candle craving admiration, Rowan's was like the steady burn of a coal stove, necessary, unnoticed until it failed, and far warmer than it appeared. He spent most of his hours at the Cowgate Free Clinic, but in the late afternoons he often returned with dirt on his boots and ink on his fingers, his overcoat soaked from rain or blood or both. He would pass Minerva in the hall with a polite nod, occasionally pausing to ask about supplies, or whether the girl in the nursery had taken to her Latin. His voice was low, unhurried. He never lingered more than needed. And yet, Minerva found herself attuned to the sound of his footsteps, to the moment his key turned in the lock, to the scent of bitter medicine that clung to him like a shadow. One Wednesday evening, she found him in the study, sleeves rolled, poring over a stack of correspondence. The fire burned low, and the rain tapped restlessly at the windows. "The printer's bill is overdue," he muttered, not noticing her at first. "Again." She cleared her throat gently. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the papers. He looked up, surprise flickering behind his eyes, before he gestured to the empty chair across the desk. "Be warned," he said. "These ledgers have defeated stronger minds." "I do not doubt it," Minerva replied, her lips curved faintly, "but I have wrestled more than numbers in my day." He watched as she straightened the stack, separating invoices from patient records with a precision that seemed to ease something in him. In that moment, Rowan McCrae saw not the governess who had once been the object of his brother's affection, but a woman with a mind sharpened by hardship and hands that had never trembled, not even when left behind. From that day onward, he began to include her in conversations once reserved for the housekeeper or the steward. He would ask her thoughts on clinic inventory, allow her to balance minor books, even leave her notes written in careful script. Check if Miss Penbury reordered quinine. "Was the cot repaired? You were right about the milk supplier, thank you. There was never flattery, never charm, only respect. And in that respect Minerva found a solace far deeper than the hollow poetry Alistair once whispered into her hair. At night, she returned to Finlay, who waited in the small room that overlooked the rear garden. He would regale her with tales of the academy, his professors, his lessons, the boy who recited Cicero as if born in Rome. His voice, eager and quick, reminded her of all they still had to fight for. "One day," he said, eyes alight, "I'll earn my own way. You won't need to stay here for my sake." Minerva reached across the table and took his ink-stained hand. "You are not my burden, Finlay. You are my reason." Elsewhere in the city, preparations unfolded for a grand charity gala hosted by none other than Mrs. Elowen Ramsay. The invitation came in a cream envelope lined with violet, sealed with black wax, as though grief could be manufactured. Minerva read it once, then twice. A gesture of thanks, it claimed, for her contributions to the McCrae family. It was not gratitude. It was a summons. A reminder of who held the gaze of the city and who merely existed beneath it. She did not wish to go, yet propriety allowed no refusal. And so she dressed in her finest, a moss-green wool gown trimmed in black velvet, high-necked and long-sleeved, with a bodice that clung not to vanity, but to pride. Her hair was drawn into a neat coil, no adornment save a single jet pin. When she entered the ballroom, the brightness struck her like a slap. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above rows of ladies in silks and pearls. Gentlemen murmured over wine, and the orchestra played a Viennese waltz no one truly listened to. Elowen stood at the center, radiant in amethyst silk, her mourning softened by fashion's hunger. Her lips curved in a smile that never touched her eyes. "Miss Kincaid," she purred, taking Minerva's hand too quickly, "how gracious of you to attend. I so admire your dedication." Minerva bowed her head. "It is kind of you to invite me, madam." She was escorted through the room like a relic, something to be observed, not touched. Conversations dimmed as she passed. Some whispered, others stared. A few offered tight smiles, laced with curiosity or pity. And all the while, Elowen watched, her gloved fingers curled around Alistair's arm like a victory. Minerva stood near the edge of the gallery, her breath tight in her chest. Her hand trembled only slightly as she reached for her glass of lemonade. Then Rowan appeared. He said nothing at first, only stood beside her, his presence a quiet shield against the noise. "I shouldn't have come," she murmured. "Perhaps," he said. "But you came, and you did not cower." She turned to face him, surprised. His gaze was steady. "You have more poise than half this room," he said, his voice so low it barely rose above the strings of the cello. "And more reason to walk away than most." She blinked, unsure how to respond. He looked at her, not as Alistair once did, not as the widow did now, but as a man looks at another who has weathered the same storm. In that crowded, glittering room, filled with vanity and velvet and polished masks, the only thing that mattered was that look. That night, as she undressed by the fire, Minerva caught sight of herself in the mirror. The gown hung heavy on its peg. Her hair was loosened, her face bare, yet she did not look diminished. She looked real. Outside, the city slept under veils of rain and gaslight. And somewhere beyond the windows, she knew, Rowan McCrae pored over ledgers, unaware that he had offered her the first kindness she had not had to earn. It was not affection, not yet, but it was something close, and it was hers. The scent of jasmine and beeswax still clung to the gown as Minerva folded it into its linen wrapping. It had been worn only once, yet it felt years old, saturated with the weight of glances, too lingering, whispers too sharp, and a single voice that still echoed in the hollow of her spine. She pressed her hand to her corseted ribs, willing the tension to release, but it remained, an invisible corset within the one she wore. The morning after the gala had dawned grey, the kind of Edinburgh sky that blurred into the chimneys without ever truly becoming day. A cold fog had rolled across the meadows, masking the city in silence and dampness. Minerva stood at the breakfast table in the McCrae residence, her hands folded with precision, her chin lifted just high enough to feign composure. She could feel them, the servants, the glances, the hush that descended each time she entered a room. Alistair McCrae had taken only a sip of his tea. His gaze flicked to her and away again, but there was something smug in the way his lips curved, as though he held a secret she could not unhear. She had not told Rowan. She had told no one. She had not needed to. The night before had been enough. Enough to shatter the last, fragile remnant of illusion she might have once held about Alistair's conscience. It had been in the side corridor of the ballroom, away from the music and mirrors, the air thick with candle smoke and the scent of expensive perfumes. She had stepped away briefly, seeking stillness when he found her. His cravat loosened, a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes warm with something too practiced to be desire. "You always did look your best in restraint," he had said, his voice low, his smile smooth. She had stood frozen, one hand on the balustrade. "Excuse me, Mr. McCrae. Don't be so cold, Minerva. We were once friends, intimate friends, if memory serves. Surely you've not forgotten what we shared." He took a step closer. "I could speak to Elowen. She owes me favours. You needn't live as a servant under my brother's roof. You were meant for more than ledger books and baby Latin." She had turned slowly, her spine straight as a ruler. "And what, pray tell, am I meant for? To be your secret once more? Your whispered indulgence while you charm another widow into filling your pockets?" His smile faltered, just for an instant. "You mistake me." "No," she said, her voice low and even. "I finally see you clearly." And she had walked away, never once turning to see if he followed. Now, seated at the same table where he lifted his cup as if nothing had passed between them, she burned with fury so still, so contained, it might have been mistaken for calm. It was Rowan who broke the silence. "We've received word that the nursery roof is leaking again. The south wing gutters never held properly." His voice was dry, practical, and yet Minerva heard the undercurrent. He had noticed something. He always did. Later that day, she found him in the courtyard, inspecting the crumbling stonework. The dampness had seeped into the walls, and his sleeves were rolled, his hands dusted with mortar. He glanced up as she approached, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Miss Kincaid," he said finally, brushing his palms together, "may I speak plainly?" Her breath caught. "You usually do, Doctor." He gave a half-smile, one that did not reach his eyes. "There are things I choose not to speak. But some silences become dangerous if left too long." She looked away, her heart thudding. "If this is about your brother—" "It isn't," he interrupted gently. "Or rather, not entirely." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. It was a notice of Finley's school fees, months overdue. "I've spoken to the bursar," he said. "They will grant a brief extension, but not much more." Shame prickled her skin. "I had hoped to catch up this spring. I have been saving." Rowan nodded. "I know." He held her gaze then, and for the first time, Minerva saw not just the physician or the brother, but the man, tired, sincere, and profoundly aware of the choices they both faced. "This household is not safe for you," he said quietly. "Not in reputation, not in standing. The city watches, the staff talk, and you are too valuable to be cast into ruin over whispers." She swallowed. "Then I should leave." "No." His voice was firm. "You should stay, but not as you are." Minerva stared at him, stunned. "I'm not offering affection," he continued, "nor am I pretending at sentiment. What I propose is a shield, a marriage in name. It will protect your station. It will allow your brother to continue his education without burden, and it will give this house a structure it desperately lacks." She said nothing for a long time. The wind stirred between them, carrying the faint scent of peat smoke and early spring. "A marriage," she said at last, her tone flat. "Of necessity, yes. No promises, no illusions?" "None." He stood still, hands clasped behind his back, as though awaiting the results of a surgery he could not control. Her answer came not with tears or protest, but with the lift of her chin. "Very well," she said. "But I want no favors for Finley. His merit must be his own." Rowan inclined his head. He would accept nothing less. They were married 3 days later in the drawing-room, the ceremony conducted by a local reverend, too old to inquire too deeply. Finlay stood by her side, his face pale but brave, wearing the same coat he used for school debates. Mrs. Penbury wept discreetly. The butler maintained a stony silence. Alistair was not present. Minerva wore a dark green wool gown, simple but dignified. She wore no veil, no flowers, no ring. Rowan offered his arm, and she took it as one might accept a hand in a storm, firmly, without hesitation, and without dreams. After the guests had dispersed, Finley pressed a folded scrap of paper into her hand. She tucked it into her glove, reading it only hours later by candlelight in her new room. "He seems kind. I hope he sees you." The words were scrawled uneven, but they reached her heart like a whisper in the quietest part of her soul. That night, Minerva stood at the window, watching fog roll across the rooftops of Edinburgh. The city had not changed. The whispers would not stop. But she had chosen, calmly, fiercely, and now she would walk forward into whatever came next. Not as a governess, not as a cast-off, but as a woman who refused to be erased. The ink on the parish registry had barely dried when Minerva Kincaid became Minerva McCrae. Not with fanfare, not with pearls, not with music, but with silence, sincerity, and necessity. There were no orange blossoms in her hair, no violins marking the rhythm of the vow. The ceremony took place in the drawing-room, beneath the portrait of Rowan's late father, whose stern countenance seemed to watch the modest union with suspicion. The Reverend's voice trembled slightly, more from age than sentiment, and the ring, simple, unadorned and loose at her knuckle, had once belonged to Rowan's grandmother. She did not cry, nor did she smile. She accepted the words, the hand, the name, with the steady grace of a woman who understood precisely what she was trading for, the right to remain standing in a world eager to see her fall. From that day forward, her room was no longer on the upper floor, but in the north wing, where the heavy stone kept out the sun. Her bed was wider, her mirror taller, and her name etched on the silver plate by the door. Yet nothing between her and Rowan changed. They spoke little, and when they did, it was of the clinic, its debts, its failing roof, its endless need. Rowan left early, returned late, and often passed her in the corridor with a quiet nod, a soft murmur of "Mrs. McRae," that sent an unfamiliar heat crawling up her neck. She took up her duties at the Cowgate Free Clinic, not as a favor, but as a function of survival. There was no time for awkwardness in rooms where children wheezed through fever and mothers wept into their palms. She reorganized the ledgers, implemented inventory rotations, and coaxed reluctant donors into small mercies with iron courtesy. Within a fortnight, the order she imposed began to reflect in the calm of the waiting room and the cautious gratitude of the staff. Nurse Calder, a sharp-eyed woman with greying curls always pinned in a rush, approached her one evening as Minerva relabeled a shelf of tinctures. "You've made this place hum again," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Like a clock, someone finally wound. Minerva allowed herself a tired smile. It was long overdue for winding. At home, she and Rowan continued to move around each other like constellations, close but never touching, orbiting within the same house, the same life, but not yet the same breath. He was a quiet man by nature, but with her, his silences deepened. At times, she sensed in them a kind of guarded attentiveness, as if he feared that too much speech might break the fragile equilibrium they had achieved. And yet, he noticed things. He noticed when her ink ran low and left a fresh bottle beside her ledger. He noticed when her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion and insisted she eat before she worked. He noticed when she stood too long by the window, watching the rain blur the garden, and placed a shawl over her shoulders without a word. One evening, long after the clinic had closed, Minerva remained bent over the accounts by candlelight. The rain tapped insistently at the window panes, and her head ached from columns of figures that refused to balance. She had not eaten since noon. Rowan entered quietly, set a cup of tea at her elbow, and stood by the hearth. He did not speak. The fire cast amber light across his face, revealing the lines of fatigue etched deep beneath his eyes. "You should rest," he said eventually. "I will," she answered, not lifting her head. He nodded, hesitated, and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Minerva." She looked up, startled by the sound of her name spoken without formality. "You're not alone," he said softly, almost inaudibly. She held his gaze for a moment too long. Then, without a word, she returned to her numbers. He left the room, and yet something of him remained in the space he had occupied, the scent of damp wool, the quiet gravity of someone who did not know how to offer comfort, but tried all the same. It was a week later when her body finally yielded to fatigue. She collapsed not at the clinic, nor at her desk, but in the middle of the corridor after descending the stairs too quickly. Her vision blurred, her knees buckled, and the world tilted into darkness. When she awoke, she was on the settee in the drawing room, the fire blazing high, a folded blanket beneath her head, and the soft clink of porcelain on the tray beside her. Rowan sat in the armchair nearby, his sleeves rolled, his brow furrowed in concern. "You fainted," he said, without preamble. "I'm fine," she whispered, struggling to rise. He placed a hand on her shoulder, firm, steady, warm. "You are not, and I won't have you working yourself into the ground to prove a point neither of us doubts." She closed her eyes. "I didn't want to be seen as weak. You are the strongest person in this house," he said, "but even strength must sleep." Their hands were close now, hers resting on the edge of the cushion, his on the armrest. Their fingers did not touch, but the heat between them seemed louder than any storm outside. He stood abruptly. "Drink the tea? It's not good, but it's hot." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. When he left the room, the absence he created felt larger than his presence. Outside the McCrae home, the winds of influence began to shift. Elowen Ramsay, always attuned to the tremors of power, had begun to observe Minerva's rising visibility with narrowed eyes. Word of the clinic's improved conditions reached her through whispered gossip at teas and luncheons, always accompanied by the same curious refrain: Mrs. McCrae's doing, not the doctor's. She did not appreciate being upstaged, nor did she forgive ambition in women she considered beneath her. And so, with subtlety honed by years of strategic mourning, she began to maneuver. She courted city officials with generous donations to other charities. She lavished funds upon the hospital board, diverting attention and goodwill away from Cowgate. Her name appeared in the society pages weekly, her likeness etched in sketch portraits, always accompanied by some mention of benevolence. Alistair, ever eager to remain within her favour, offered assistance without recognizing the strings wrapped tightly around his wrists. "She's too clever, Alistair," Elowen murmured one evening, her gloved fingers tapping the edge of her wineglass. "And clever women are best when carefully placed, out of sight." He laughed, dismissing the comment. "She's married to my brother now. Whatever fire she once had will cool." Elowen smiled, slow and knowing. "Fire does not cool, darling. It only burns quietly, until it consumes." That night Minerva returned home late, the hem of her gown damp, her eyes ringed with fatigue. She passed Rowan in the hall, their shoulders brushing in the narrow passage. "Good evening," he said. She paused. "Good evening." They looked at one another, words trembling on the edges of mouths too accustomed to restraint. And then she continued on, the silence between them stretched taut, not as distance, but as promise. In a world full of whispers, ambition, and brittle allegiances, their quiet understanding was the only thing neither of them questioned. It was not love, not yet, but it was something deeper than silence, and stronger than fear. The stench of illness hung heavy over the Cowgate. It clung to the stone alleys, seeped through the damp foundations, and wove itself into the cloth of the poor like a second skin. By the second week of March, the whispers had become cries, and the cries had become coughing, wet, relentless, unmistakable. Typhoid had returned, unannounced and cruel, and it did not wait for permission to spread. At the Cowgate Free Clinic, the air changed before the staff had time to speak of it. Patients no longer arrived in orderly lines. They collapsed at the threshold, were carried in on makeshift stretchers, or leaned trembling against the walls while clutching children with fevered brows. The waiting room, once quiet under Minerva's stern guidance, had become a place of dread. Rowan McCrae barely slept. His beard grew coarse from neglect, his hands stained from iodine and ink, and his collar wilted from sweat. He moved from one cot to the next, like a man possessed, his low voice murmuring instructions, comfort, prayers. He refused to abandon anyone, not the laundress gasping through shallow breaths, nor the boy who clung to a soiled blanket and muttered nonsense between convulsions. And behind him, always behind him, Minerva. She did not wield scalpels or diagnose ailments, but her mind became the spine of the clinic's survival. From sunrise to long after the oil lamps had burned low, she orchestrated chaos into coherence. She charted treatment rotations, arranged food for families stranded by illness, and scrawled notes to donors with language as cutting as it was elegant. Finlay, though barely 17, begged to help. "I can copy records, deliver messages, clean what others won't," he pleaded one morning, eyes shining with fierce resolve. Minerva hesitated, but Rowan nodded. "Let him," he said. "He knows what's at stake." So Finlay joined the effort, a lanky figure darting between buildings, ink-stained hands clutched around envelopes and account sheets, his boots soaked with Edinburgh's endless rain. By the fourth week, supplies grew scarce, fever blankets were rationed, carbolic soap disappeared, and yet one morning a delivery arrived, a gleaming oak crate of surgical instruments, engraved with curling script and tied with an ivory ribbon. Elowen Ramsay's charity seal was stamped on the parcel. Alistair arrived minutes later, crisp as ever, in a navy frock coat with brass buttons polished to shine. He entered with the ease of a man who had never waited for anything in his life. "A token," he said lightly, gesturing to the crate. "From the widow. She thought of you." Rowan accepted the instruments with a nod. "They will help." Minerva said nothing, but her eyes followed Alistair as he walked the perimeter of the clinic, a half-smile playing on his lips as though admiring a painting. "You've made something of this place," he told her, leaning in. "Efficient, cold perhaps, but not without grace." She resisted the urge to recoil. "People die less often when systems function," he chuckled. "Still the same woman. I suppose some things resist refinement." She turned away without replying, but the weight of his words pressed like frost against her ribs. That night, she reviewed the latest receipts in the back office. The fire had burned low, and the lantern cast trembling shadows over the ledgers. Her fingers traced the lists, gauze, alcohol, tinctures, and paused. The numbers did not add up. The invoice showed 6 crates. The staff had recorded 4. She turned to the prior week, another discrepancy, duplicate charges for quinine, and an odd gap in the supplier names, entries scrawled with vague initials, no addresses. A chill passed through her despite the heat of the room. She brought the papers to Rowan, who stood at the end of the hallway, coat damp from the evening rounds. "These figures," she whispered, placing the sheets into his hand, "are wrong." He scanned them slowly, his brow furrowing. "Are you certain?" "I triple-checked them." Rowan looked at her then, really looked. Not as one questions a subordinate, but as a man on the edge of belief. "I trust your instincts," he said, voice low. It was the first time he had said such words to her. Not as praise, not as appeasement, but as truth. Her throat tightened. She turned back to the room, her hands trembling as she closed the ledger. The next morning, Alistair returned, unannounced, with another parcel, this time marked as antiseptics, though the weight felt suspiciously light. Minerva intercepted him in the vestibule. "The quantities on the invoices don't match what we receive," she said. Alistair tilted his head. "You're quite bold these days." "I keep records," she replied evenly. "Records can be misunderstood." He stepped closer. The hallway stretched around them, empty save for the ticking of a clock and the faint moan of wind against the windows. "Minerva," he said softly, "best not to overreach. This clinic is a fragile thing. So is your position in it." Her jaw clenched, but she said nothing, only watched him leave, his steps too casual for the storm he had just unleashed. Later that evening she sat in the back room again, the fire crackling, papers spread like battlegrounds. She felt Rowan before she heard him. He entered with his sleeves rolled, his shoulders heavy with fatigue. She handed him a chart of supply numbers. "It's happening under our roof," she murmured, "right in front of us." He nodded, no longer questioning, only processing. "I will speak to the board," he said, "but quietly. We cannot afford enemies while we are still standing on splinters." Minerva looked at him then, and in his face she saw the cost of honesty, the wounds it opened, the loyalties it tested. "You're risking your name." "I am," he replied. "So are you." She leaned back, eyes burning from lack of sleep. "What else can we do?" He did not answer. Instead, he moved to the desk, took the quill from her hand, and dipped it in ink. Then beside her notes, he wrote a single line. "No more shipments from Elowen Ramsay's charity until verified in person." Minerva stared at the words. Her hand reached for his. Just briefly, their fingers did not touch, but the space between them throbbed with shared resolve. In the distance, the bells of St. Giles tolled the hour. Outside, Edinburgh slept fitfully, unaware that in one modest clinic, two people sat side by side, defending the forgotten with paper, fire, and faith. And though no one sang of it, though no headlines bore their names, the battle for the truth had begun, with ink, silence, and the faint tremble of a woman's hand as she turned the page toward war. The mahogany-panelled chamber of Edinburgh's Health Oversight Council was designed to intimidate. It was a room where whispers carried farther than shouts, where the velvet curtains muffled dissent, and where polished boots echoed with self-importance across marble floors. Minerva had never been summoned there before. She stood at Rowan's side in a simple grey wool gown with a high collar and unadorned sleeves. Her gloves were mended at the seams, her bonnet modest, and her spine impossibly straight. She carried a folio of documents clutched tightly against her chest, facts, numbers, patterns of deceit traced with sleepless care. Her only armour. Rowan, beside her, looked as though carved from quiet granite. His dark frock coat was damp from the drizzle outside, his cravat slightly askew, and his eyes, those weary, watchful eyes, held the tempered caution of a man accustomed to navigating rooms filled with sharp teeth, dressed in soft silk. At the centre of it all stood Elowen Ramsay. Draped in deep, violet satin trimmed with black jet, her gown whispered wealth with every movement. Her mourning was now ceremonial, less grief and more performance. Her gloves were lace, her veil translucent enough to see the proud tilt of her chin, the unyielding gleam in her brown eyes. She moved with theatrical grace, her presence commanding the space like a queen returning to court. When she began to speak, the room fell into reverent silence. Her voice was smooth, patient, and adorned with cultivated sorrow. "It is not the intent of my committee to cast aspersions," she said, lifting her gloved hand as if to scatter away blame like a bit of dust. "But we are stewards of public generosity, and it is our solemn duty to ensure that the resources entrusted to our care are not only spent, but spent wisely." Minerva's stomach tightened. "The Cowgate Free Clinic," Elowen continued, "while noble in its purpose, appears overextended. We have received troubling reports, duplicate requests for supplies, irregular patient outcomes, misplaced donations. Perhaps not malice," she added with a pained smile. "Perhaps merely the result of mismanagement." A ripple moved through the council. Rowan tensed. Minerva opened her folio, her fingers trembling with urgency. She leaned closer, her voice low. "I can refute that. Let me speak. I have every invoice, every discrepancy tied to her own suppliers." But Rowan's hand, warm and steady, touched hers. His voice was barely a breath. "Not yet." Minerva froze. Her heart pounded. "If we wait, not until it can't be denied," he murmured, eyes fixed on the men in the chamber. "Now they are listening, but not yet believing." She clenched her jaw, lips pressed into a line, and slowly closed the folio. Her hands remained on it, as if bracing against a tide. When the meeting adjourned, Elowen swept past them like a winter wind. She paused only for a moment, her gaze drifting over Minerva with pointed amusement. "My dear," she said, her voice syrup-sweet, "I do hope you're finding married life sustaining, though I imagine it offers fewer entertainments than you once knew." Minerva met her gaze squarely. "Entertainments fade, integrity endures." Elowen's smile curled like a ribbon, twisting in firelight. "So very poetic. You've grown clever since we last spoke." "I was always clever," Minerva replied quietly. "You simply preferred me silent." That evening, the walk home was conducted in brittle silence, broken only by the slap of rain against cobblestones and the occasional distant call of a newspaper boy echoing down the alleys. When they entered the house, Rowan shed his soaked coat without speaking. Minerva set her folio on the table with controlled force. "You shouldn't have stopped me," she said at last, her voice low and tight. "We weren't ready," he replied, pulling off his gloves. "We were prepared. That's not the same thing." She stepped toward him, fire rising in her chest. You let her dictate the narrative. Again. Rowan turned, jaw clenched. This isn't about pride, Minerva. No, she snapped. It's about survival. And silence is no longer a shield. It's a noose. He exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. I am trying to protect the clinic. If we accuse without proof that cannot be dismissed, we lose everything. And if we wait too long, there will be nothing left to lose. Their eyes locked, tension simmering like a storm caught beneath skin. His voice dropped, quieter but no less sharp. Must we fight each other too? Minerva's lips trembled, but she refused to look away. I don't know how to do this when you treat me like a risk instead of a partner. He did not answer. That night, he slept in the surgery. She heard the creak of the old cot as he settled into it, the distant clang of a kettle he boiled himself. The silence between them was no longer gentle. It was cold. It had edges now. At dawn, he returned to the study. His coat, nearly torn at the hem, lay folded over the chair, neatly mended. A cup of tea, warm but unsipped, waited on the desk. He stared at it for a long moment. When Minerva entered moments later, her sleeves rolled, her hair braided back in haste. She did not acknowledge the offerings. She moved to the shelves, retrieving the apothecary inventory. As she turned, her hand brushed the edge of the counter, where a flask had cracked hours before and remained unnoticed. The jagged glass sliced her palm, deep and quick. She gasped, clutching her hand. Rowan was beside her in an instant. Let me, he said, already reaching for the cloth on the windowsill. He took her hand gently, cradling it in both of his. She tried not to flinch, but the touch, so careful, so human, undid something in her. He cleaned the wound in silence, his brow furrowed, his fingers steady. When he wrapped the bandage around her hand, their eyes met. I shouldn't have doubted you, he said, barely above a whisper. Minerva swallowed, voice catching in her throat. I never doubted you at all. The words lingered, fragile and unguarded. Between them, something shifted. Not erased, not healed, but softened. Rowan finished tying the bandage and released her hand slowly as though reluctant to let go. You work too hard, he said softly. It's the only way I know how to stand. He smiled then, tired, sad, but real. Then we'll keep standing. Together. She nodded, unable to speak. The moment passed, but its echo remained, echoed in the way they moved side by side that morning, in the rhythm of two people bruised but unbroken, determined not to vanish beneath the weight of another's performance. In a city where power wore velvet and corruption hid behind veils of lace, the truth still lived in quieter things, in hands that steadied one another, in silence made sacred, in the slow and necessary stitching of trust. The storm broke over Edinburgh like a judgment. Rain lashed the city's roofs with fury, churning the gutters of Cowgate into winding rivers of ash and mud. The streets glistened under a blanket of clouded grey, and even the chimneys seemed to moan against the wind. But inside the clinic, Minerva's world narrowed to ink columns and the unmistakable stench of something rotten. Her fingers traced down yet another receipt, her brow furrowed, lips tight with calculation. There it was again, a name that had begun to appear too often, too conveniently. J. McGreevy, supplier of medicines and bandages. The handwriting always shifted slightly, sometimes neat, sometimes hurried, but the address was the same, and the quantities listed unbelievable. A clinic their size had never ordered that much carbolic acid, nor could they afford to. She turned to Finlay, who sat at the corner desk, copying medical records with feverish precision. The boy's sleeves were rolled to the elbow, his wrists ink-stained, his eyes sharp with the hunger of purpose. He looked up the moment she said his name. I need you to do something for me, she said. He nodded instantly. You've seen the delivery cart that comes on Thursdays, the one with the green tarp, the one that doesn't stop at the main door, he asked. Yes, she said softly. I want you to follow it. Don't be seen. Don't speak. Just watch. Sketch what you can. Be back before sundown. Finley blinked once but did not flinch. "All right." Minerva touched his arm, her grip tender and firm. "Be careful." The boy vanished into the rain with a notebook hidden beneath his coat. Minerva stood at the window for a long time after, watching until even the shape of his silhouette dissolved into the grey. She returned to the ledgers and waited. With every hour that passed, her heart pressed tighter against her ribs. When Finley returned, his coat was soaked through, and his hair plastered to his forehead. He peeled off his gloves at the door and said only, "You were right." He laid the notebook on the desk and opened to the page. There were sketches, crates half empty, barrels marked for hospitals that had been diverted, piles of discarded labels. On the last page, in a script that was neither childish nor professional, Finley had copied the markings from the crates. E.R. Charitable Holdings. A stamp, a seal, and beside them, on an invoice pinned to the inner wall of the warehouse, a signature, Alistair McCrae. Minerva stared at it for a long time, her body still. Her pulse had risen, but her breath came in slow, steady waves. Rowan appeared behind her, drawn by the silence, and took the notebook from her trembling hands. He read it carefully, page by page, his jaw tightening with every entry. When he reached the last signature, he sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "It's him," she whispered. "His name is there. His approval. His seal." Rowan didn't reply. He closed the book and ran a hand over his face. "He signed off on stolen supplies," she continued. "He authorized those transactions." Rowan looked at her then, not with doubt, but with the same quiet sorrow she had seen in the face of mothers whose children would not wake. "I believe you," he said. "I believe Finley. But you must consider, he may not have known. Elwyn could have placed papers in front of him. She has the means to mask anything. He's not cautious, not like you." Minerva turned away, her hands gripping the back of the chair until her knuckles whitened. "He's not a fool," she said. "He's vain, yes. Thoughtless, yes, but not blind. He had to know something." Rowan's voice was gentle. "Then what would you have me do? Confront him publicly? Bring scandal to the clinic when we are still on fragile footing?" She turned to face him, her cheeks flushed with the heat of restrained fury. "I would have us name what we see," she said. "Not yet to the world, but to ourselves. Let's not ruin a man who's been used, yes, but let's not spare one who allowed it either." He rose then, slowly, as though pulled upward by her conviction. They stood face to face, no longer just physician and administrator, no longer just husband and wife in name, but something steadier, something forged not in romance, but in resistance. "I will speak to the board," he said, privately, quietly. Minerva nodded. "And I'll continue tracking the invoices, every order, every signature." Outside, thunder cracked low across the hills. Later that evening, in the quiet shelter of the kitchen, she prepared tea. The hearth glowed low, and the sound of rain softened into a murmur against the stone walls. Her hands were tired, her sleeves damp from the washing up, but the work gave her comfort. Order in small things when the world felt askew. Rowan entered, not speaking, only standing near her as she stirred the sugar. He reached for the teacup, but his fingers brushed hers. She froze. So did he. Their hands lingered there, side by side, warm, tentative. He did not move away. When she looked up, his gaze was already waiting. "I don't know what this is between us," she said softly, "but it steadies me." He stepped closer, his voice low, raw with vulnerability. "You carry so much. You walk into fire and make it look like prayer." She blinked, stunned by the ache in his words. His hand remained near hers. She did not pull away. They drank tea in silence, side by side at the kitchen table, where the flicker of lamplight cast long shadows against the stone. Outside, the city hummed and churned, unaware of the moment that passed between them, not dramatic, not spoken aloud, but real. When Minerva returned to her room that night, she carried the weight of the ledger in one hand and the warmth of that moment in the other. Elowyn's web might tighten, Alistair's name might darken. The path ahead might fracture into danger and scandal. But in the quiet places of the house, in the softened gestures between glances and hands, something had begun to shift. Not love, not yet, but the shape of its coming. The fever returned like a thief in the night, quicker this time, meaner, as if it had learned the weaknesses of the people and aimed straight for them. It swept through the Bramble Row tenements, tight quarters where families shared blankets and breath, where windows never opened and water was fetched from a communal pump already tainted with rot. Within days, the children burned with it. The mothers wept. And the clinic, fragile, heroic, overburdened, buckled beneath its weight. The air inside the Cowgate Free Clinic grew dense with sweat, carbolic and dread. The narrow corridors no longer echoed with hurried footsteps. They throbbed with the dull rhythm of human suffering. Every cot was filled. Every bench in the waiting room held the bent spine of someone praying for mercy. Minerva worked without pause. She no longer wore gloves. The material tore too quickly, and her hands, raw from washing and soaked in vinegar and soap, bore small cracks along the knuckles. She moved with practiced urgency, her voice calm and clipped as she directed volunteers to boil cloths, ration laudanum, and sort through what little quinine remained. Beside her, Rowan moved like a shadow, quiet, sure, relentless. He had not slept in over 36 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, his collar open, his sleeves stained to the elbow, but his mind was clear, and his hands never faltered. 6 more cases, he murmured, as they stepped into the next ward. All children, none older than 10. Minerva closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with steel. Have we any broth left? Half a pot. It'll stretch if we dilute it. Stretch it, she said, and write down every dose. If someone comes asking, we'll answer with facts. They worked without speaking after that, the silence between them rich with shared pain, tension, and a trust neither of them dared name aloud. Just after midnight, as they were changing the linens on a cot where a young seamstress moaned in delirium, Nurse Calder called them to the back entrance. Her face, usually sharp with brisk command, was pale and unsure. "There's someone here," she said. "He won't come in. Says he has something for Mrs. McCrae." Minerva exchanged a look with Rowan. She followed Calder to the alley door, her heart pounding not with fear but a grim anticipation. She knew who it would be before she even saw him. Alistair stood in the shadow of the archway, his greatcoat dripping rain onto the cobbles. His eyes were hollow, rimmed with shame, and for the first time in all their years he looked like a man who knew what he had become. "I shouldn't be here," he said, "but I had to, before it's too late." He held out a thick envelope. Minerva took it, her fingers brushing the edge of his glove. "It's everything," he whispered. "Invoices, signatures, letters from Ilawan. I kept them. I don't know why I kept them." She stared at him, the rain soaking through her hair. "Because you did know. You just didn't want to admit it." His breath caught. "What will you do with it?" "Tell the truth," she said, "with or without your name attached." Alistair's eyes dropped. "I thought she'd save me. I thought if I kept quiet long enough the rot would pass." Minerva tucked the envelope beneath her shawl. "The rot never passes on its own. Someone has to cut it out." He gave a half nod, then turned and disappeared into the dark. His shoulders hunched, his gait that of a man finally stripped of illusion. Back inside, Minerva laid the envelope on the desk in the dispensary and took a single breath before returning to the ward. Rowan was kneeling beside an elderly man whose pulse had slowed to nearly nothing. When he saw her return, something in his expression shifted, not in his hands, not in his work, but in the place behind his eyes. He recognized the change in her. "What did he give you?" he asked softly. "Proof," she said, enough to end her reach. He looked down at the dying man and whispered, "Not soon enough for him." They stayed through the night. Together, they washed bodies, eased pain, fed the few who could still swallow. When the firewood ran low, Rowan pulled apart broken chairs. When Minerva's head began to dip from exhaustion, he touched her elbow, not to command, only to steady. Dawn broke quietly, a smear of dull gold above the slates. Inside the clinic, there was no triumph, no applause, only stillness and breath and the subtle weight of survival. Rowan collapsed first. He lowered himself onto the floor beside a cot and leaned his head back against the wall. Minerva was at his side in a moment, her hands reaching instinctively. "Don't," he murmured. "Let me, just for a moment." She sat beside him, and without thinking, he let his head fall into her lap. It startled her, this sudden surrender from a man who had held everything so tightly for so long. She looked down at him, at the dark curls damp with sweat, the furrow in his brow even in sleep. "Minerva," he whispered, "not Mrs. McCrae, not you. Just her name, as if it were a prayer falling from cracked lips." She rested a hand on his temple and let it stay there. The warmth of him grounded her, steadied her, as the tears she had not allowed began to well in her eyes. "I'm here," she whispered. "I won't leave you." He did not respond, but his breathing deepened and the furrow eased. She did not move for a long time. Later, while Rowan slept and Nurse Calder watched the fevered girl in the corner, Minerva rose and went to the office. She sealed the envelope Alistair had given her with a ribbon and penned only one line on the front. "For the Council's eyes. Urgent and anonymous." She sent a boy, barefoot, red-cheeked and hungry-looking, with a coin and the envelope to the Health Council office. No one would know who sent it, but once it was opened, no one would be able to deny what it contained. In the smallness of that act, something grand had shifted. A reckoning had begun, not in front of a crowd or from a pulpit, but in a quiet clinic where truth had been planted in blood and disinfectant and held together by two hands, refusing to let the other fall. Outside, the city began to stir. Church bells called the faithful, horses clattered across cobblestones, and high above, in her parlour gilded with secrets, Elowyn Ramsay poured her morning tea, unaware that her veil had begun to tear. The first light of justice had pierced the fog, and somewhere beneath it, Minerva Kincaid, no longer only a governess, no longer only a wife in name, stood upright in her exhaustion, unbroken, her heart aching with something that looked very much like love. Edinburgh had not seen such spectacle since the Queen's last visit. Gas lamps flickered along the frost-laced streets, casting golden halos against the glass panes of Belgrave House, where lanterns burned like constellations gathered for judgment. The McCraes had once called this home, but now it belonged to Elowyn Ramsay, widow, heiress, patroness and hostess of the gala that would, in her mind, restore her place atop polite society. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed into a theatre of defiance. Violet ribbons curled around candelabra. Servants in white gloves moved like ghosts between velvet-draped columns. Guests arrived in waves, bankers, judges, viscountesses, editors of moralistic periodicals, all drawn by the scent of scandal and the promise of music. At the head of the room, beneath a chandelier dripping with crystal and pretense, stood Elowyn Ramsay. She wore violet silk, so deep it shimmered like spilled ink, with diamonds stitched at the neckline and wrists. Her hair was coiffed into sharp waves, her lips painted to match a late winter plum. She greeted each guest with the practiced warmth of a woman unbothered by rumour, untouched by consequence. But even she could not control the whisper beneath the waltz, the murmured speculations of ledger forgeries, clinic misappropriations, and the return of a governess who should have vanished with her pride. Beyond the square, a carriage rolled to a stop. Minerva Kincaid stepped down first. She wore no jewels. Her gown was slate blue, simple in silhouette but immaculately tailored, the sort of dress that whispered rather than sang. Her dark hair was pinned with care, not vanity, and a narrow ribbon, Finley's favourite grey, tied at the nape. At her side, Rowan McCrae offered his arm. He was sombre in black, his cravat loosely knotted as though he'd dressed in silence, not ceremony. But his presence commanded the chill night air. They ascended the steps. The footman, uncertain, announced them softly, too softly. Yet silence rolled across the ballroom like a drawn curtain. Conversations died mid-sentence. Flutes of champagne tilted, then paused. Even the violinist stilled his bow, the note fading like breath on glass. Minerva crossed the marble floor slowly, her hand curled around a worn leather folio. She stopped just shy of the orchestra pit. Rowan stepped back, giving her space, though his gaze never left her. Elowen, radiant atop her platform of reputation, narrowed her eyes. "Mrs. McCrae," she said, her voice cutting the quiet. "To what do we owe this unexpected honor?" Minerva's reply was calm, clear. To let facts speak where charity once wore masks. And with that she opened the folio. Inside, crisp against black velvet lining, lay pages bearing seals, signatures and dates, proof of manipulated invoices, double charges, vanished deliveries. Letters penned by Elowen's own hand, authorizing fraudulent dispersals in elegant script, and at the bottom the ledger copies Finlay had sketched with such trembling precision. Gasps broke like glass across the room. The Lord Chamberlain squinted at a signature. Lady Ashcombe clutched her pearls and took a step back, and Elowen froze. Her smile, always just a breath away, flickered and died. "She was nothing," she hissed, the whisper sharper than any shout. "A governess, a servant in my house. You forget your place." Rowan stepped forward. "No," he said, voice low, resonant. "You forget mine. She is not only my wife but my colleague, my equal. And she will not be diminished by a title you use like a blade." The hush became a roar. The room split in two, some drawing closer, others slipping away, as if proximity to Minerva might stain their silk. Elowen's hand trembled. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for allegiance, finding only caution and calculation. She swayed, staggered back a step, then collapsed onto the nearest chaise, her satin skirts pooling like a fallen banner. No one moved to help her. Not even Alistair, who stood near the rear wall, his cravat askew, his face ashen. He watched it all unfold, the unravelling of a dynasty built on appearance and borrowed power. The downfall not of a villainess, but of a woman so desperate to preserve her image she never cared who bled beneath it. And Alistair, once so fond of mirrors, could no longer bear to see himself in her ruin. He slipped out through the service corridor, unnoticed, unthanked, unwept. As the ballroom hummed with moral realignment, Minerva lowered her folio. She did not bow, she did not curtsy. She merely turned and returned to Rowan's side. "I was afraid I'd falter," she said, her voice barely audible. "You didn't," he replied. "You stood." They did not wait for applause. They left while the room still echoed with their names, with the fracture of illusion and the first notes of something better. Outside, the cold air embraced them like truth. Their carriage waited at the edge of the square, its lanterns flickering. Minerva stepped in first. Rowan followed, settling opposite her in the shadowed warmth. He didn't speak for a long while. Neither did she. Only as the city lights dimmed behind them did he reach across the narrow space and take her hand. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, and there, in the hush between disgrace and dawn, they sat, two people who had weathered cruelty, silence and fire, and had chosen, not survival, but integrity. The world outside kept spinning, but in that carriage, with her hand in his, the axis finally shifted. The last frost of March clung to the edges of Edinburgh's roofs like the ghost of winter refusing to let go. But in Cowgate, change no longer whispered, it bloomed. The air had shifted. The clinic's doors, once worn and battered, now opened to a steady stream of patients, city inspectors, midwives and mothers. Donations came, not from whispered promises at galas, but from doctors and magistrates who had seen what quiet courage could build when spectacle collapsed. Minerva McCrae stood behind the apothecary table with her sleeves rolled and her mind sharp. She no longer merely recorded names and treatments, she instructed. On most afternoons, a cluster of women gathered in the back room where she taught the boiling point of water, how to bind wounds, and the difference between a chill and a fever. These were lessons not printed in ledgers, but etched into survival. Mothers who had once feared to speak now asked questions. Young girls wrote notes with borrowed pencils. Rowan often passed the door in silence, listening. He had taken on additional responsibilities at the infirmary, not by mandate, but request. His name now accompanied city correspondence, and he was called Dr. McCrae, with deference, not resignation. But when his rounds were done, he returned to the clinic, always. Sometimes with new tinctures, sometimes with new burdens, always with the same expression that softened only in her presence. Their marriage had become something not easily defined. It was not a tale of grand gestures or declarations. It was the way he set a second teacup beside her before she asked. The way she learned which lamp burned least when his eyes ached. It was shared space, shared breath, the quiet grace of choosing one another every day. They laughed more now, not loud but full. The kind of laughter that belonged to people who had known sorrow deeply and still chosen to reach for warmth. In the evenings, Rowan would often sit with Finlay, discussing anatomy or Latin phrases while Minerva worked nearby. The boy's shoulders had broadened, and his voice had found a steadiness that no longer seemed borrowed from adulthood, but claimed by it. He had grown, not just taller, but freer. Then came the letter. It arrived with the morning post in a heavy official envelope sealed with the crest of King's College London. Finlay tore it open with trembling fingers. He read, then reread, lips parted in stunned silence. Finally he turned to Minerva, the paper crushed in his hand, and said only one word: scholarship. She did not speak. She could not. She simply crossed the room, wrapped her arms around him, and held him while his shoulders shook with disbelief. A week later, the trunks were packed. On Finlay's final night at home, the fire crackled low in the hearth as the siblings stood together. He was already dressed in his travelling coat, the buttons mismatched as always. She reached to fix them, just as she had done since he was 5. Her fingers trembled. "I don't know how to leave you," he whispered. "You're not leaving," she replied. "You're becoming." He smiled, a little crooked, a little braver than he felt. Then, with the solemnity of a grown man and the heart of the boy he had been, he took her hand and kissed it. "You saved us both," he said. And then he was gone. The house felt hollow for a time. His laughter no longer echoed from the stairwell. His boots were not left muddy by the door. The silence pressed in like fog, but Minerva knew better than to call it absence. It was the sound of something fulfilled. That evening, as dusk curled along the city's edges, Rowan found her seated in the parlour, with a half-finished letter resting on her lap. The ink had dried. Her thoughts had drifted elsewhere. "He'll do well," Rowan said, his voice low. "He already has," she replied. She closed the letter, setting it aside. Rowan reached for her hand, not urgently, not ceremonially, but with quiet certainty. She followed him through the corridor and up to the study. The room smelled faintly of ink and eucalyptus. A fire glowed in the grate, throwing long shadows across the floor. He walked to the window and opened it. The air was cool, but not bitter. Beyond the panes, the city lights shimmered like lanterns floating on a sea of stone. Smoke curled from chimneys. Far below, the clip-clop of hooves echoed on cobblestones. Edinburgh breathed. Rowan stood with his back to the window, his hands braced on the sill. He did not look at her when he spoke. "It was never just about survival," he said. "That night at the clinic, I realized I wasn't fighting to endure anymore. You taught me to hope." Minerva stepped beside him. Her shoulder brushed his. She had spent so many months guarding herself against disappointment, against want, against the illusion of belonging. But here now, there was nothing left to shield. The war had been waged, and somehow both of them had made it to the other side. She leaned into him, his arm wrapped around her waist with instinct, not permission. She laid her head on his shoulder. The wind stirred the curtain. The candle on the writing desk flickered, but did not go out. They stood like that until the light dimmed and the silence softened into something else, not absence, not fear, but peace. The window remained open, the room stayed warm, and outside the world kept spinning, bright, uncertain, alive. Edinburgh, spring of 1871. The city had changed its rhythm in subtle, stubborn ways. The carriages moved no faster, but the streets held more light. Children no longer crossed to the other side of the road when passing Cowgate. The scent of antiseptic now mingled with blooming heather, and on the brass plaque outside a modest stone building, the name engraved in steady script read, "The McCrae Kincaid Clinic for Public Health and Women's Instruction." Inside, sunlight spilled through tall windows onto rows of ledgers, jars, and teaching slates. A young girl recited the steps to purify water as her classmates watched, wide-eyed. In the back, a door stood ajar to an office filled with papers, dried herbs, and the soft sound of a child's laughter. Minerva sat at the desk, holding a boy on her knee. He had Rowan's eyes, clear, sharp green with a touch of storm, but his curls were her own, dark and unmanageable, and when he smiled, something in the room stilled. She pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Back to your father," she said softly. The boy nodded solemnly, then dashed down the hall toward the surgery where Rowan waited, coat half-buttoned, spectacles perched on his nose, already mid-consultation with a patient twice his size and half his stubbornness. They had named the boy Finlay Rowan McCrae, because some names must echo beyond lifetimes. Their son was nearly 4 now. He had been born during a quiet night in early spring, with the daffodils just beginning to break through frost. Rowan had delivered him himself, hands steady, voice hoarse with wonder. In that moment Minerva had wept, not from pain, but from the overwhelming knowledge that something sacred had come of a marriage, born in necessity. They never had another child, not by choice nor by tragedy, just the one, and that was enough. Elowyn Ramsay had not attended the christening. She had fled Edinburgh in disgrace within weeks of the gala. For a time, her name appeared in court reports and social columns, tied to rumours of debt and poor investments. In the end, she vanished to the continent, France perhaps, or Italy. No one asked after her any more. Alistair McCrae's fate had been less theatrical, but no less solitary. He remained in Edinburgh for 2 years after the scandal, working quietly at a private practice, seen often at the back pews of church, but rarely in conversation. He never married. In time, he left the city altogether. Minerva received a letter once, unsigned but unmistakable in its tone. It offered no apology, only a wish that she had found peace. She had. Peace looked like Rowan sleeping with his glasses still on, like the slow rituals of evening tea, like hearing her son pronounce hygiene with an extra syllable and a sense of pride. Finlay, the elder, had returned from London the previous year, taller, leaner, carrying a leather satchel and a professor's brow. He had earned top honours and declined a government post in favour of returning to the very street that had raised him. He now ran a school just 2 doors down from the clinic. At night, he often dined with Minerva and Rowan, his voice deeper, but his questions no less curious. He had never stopped calling her Min, even when society insisted on Mrs. McCrae. That, too, was peace. On Sundays, the family walked together to the green behind Greyfriars Kirk. Rowan would carry young Finlay on his shoulders while the elder Finlay debated Aristotle with his sister over seed cake. They never rushed these afternoons. They had learned, in the hardest of ways, that time was a luxury not everyone received. Sometimes at twilight, Minerva would sit by the parlour window, gazing out as the light folded itself over the rooftops. She would watch women walk home from work, some nurses now, some teachers, others young mothers, and think of how little and how much had changed. She did not miss her old life, not the lace, not the loneliness wrapped in silk. What she had now was not a fairy tale, it was harder, braver, truer. Love, she had learned, did not arrive like thunder. It came like the tide, pulling, receding, returning, steady, constant, and sure. Rowan would often find her there, lost in thought. He would press a kiss to her hair, no longer afraid to show her the tenderness he once thought unmanly. They would sit together in silence, fingers intertwined. The window stayed open. The fire burned low, and the city outside glowed, not perfect, not quiet, but alive, just like them. Some stories are embroidered with silk and lace. Others are stitched with quiet courage, sacrifice, and second chances. Minerva's journey began with heartbreak, but what she built from its ruins became a testament to the kind of love that does not dazzle, but endures. She was not chosen at first, not adored by society, not cloaked in fortune, and yet she changed lives, not by raising her voice, but by standing her ground, by healing with knowledge, leading with grace, and loving deeply, quietly, and fiercely. This story reminds us that the heart has room to rebuild, that dignity survives even betrayal, and that hope, when nurtured, can outgrow even the deepest wounds. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin not in ballrooms, but in clinics, kitchens, and the steady light of windows left open. If Minerva's strength moved you, if Rowan's silent loyalty stirred something in your soul, if little Finley's growth made your heart ache in the best way, then we invite you to leave a comment below and tell us, what part of this story stayed with you the longest? And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word lantern in the comments. That way, we'll know who truly walked every step of this journey with us. If you'd like to support the team behind these stories, you can send a super thanks right here on YouTube with any amount your heart feels called to give. It helps us continue creating these deeply emotional, carefully crafted historical romances for you. But if now's not the time to contribute financially, that's perfectly okay. Another beautiful way to support us is by sharing this story with someone you know who loves timeless tales of strength and love. And if you're still yearning for more period dramas that echo through the soul, check out the other stories I've linked in the cards. They're waiting for you with open doors and beating hearts. Thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in stories that matter.